Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us today with our Zoom Q&A, where we are going to be looking at well, we're getting down to the end of the course. We're looking at lesson 9. So we're looking at that zone 1 assignment. Well, that's the primary portion of the assignment. Obviously, there's the building surveys in there. So this should be an interesting Q&A to go through and just sort of clarify anybody's questions that you might have. So maybe what we'll do is just take a peek at the assignment itself and look. I think there is one question on our Google Doc. Let me see if that's the case. Yeah, from Marion. Okay, we will take a look at that. But let's start with the assignment itself. Okay. So yes, lesson 9. It's amazing how quickly the course goes, even with a 20-week program. So you've all been doing some really nice work, and definitely looking forward to seeing what you come up with your zone 1 design. But with lesson number 9, as you can see, we have 2 different components, and it's a building survey, which is worth 4 points. And then we're looking at zone 1 integrated system design for 14. So you can certainly see where you will most likely put most of your energy is into that zone 1 design assignment. And if we go, I think the building survey is pretty obvious, and I haven't seen many challenges come out of that with students. However, if we look at the zone 1 integrated design, that is, I wouldn't say trickier, but it's certainly a point in the course where we are taking everything that we've learned up to date and trying to integrate this into our assignment. And just to give you a little heads up with the way I work, you'll probably find the work you do on your zone 1, if you were to revisit this in even a 2 or 3 month period, that you might have some different ideas that come out of that. So I think that's a good thing in terms of your design skills, and these are ongoing. And for those who want to take this and utilize it in a business down the road, you will probably find that as your skills increase through repetition, through doing new designs, that your process will change a little bit, as well as just your whole knowledge base expanding. And the more that expands, the more you realize what you don't know, which is it's pretty extensive. It's a huge rabbit hole, this well, permaculture design and regenerative design itself. So it can really grab you for a lifetime of learning. Okay, so if we take a look at zone 1, we all know what zone 1 refers to, and this may be the one part of the assignment where some students go beyond their zone 1. So if you're in an urban setting, your zone 1 compared to the rest of your property is probably going to be there will be a higher percentage of zone 1 versus if you were on acreage. So I'm on 5 acres. Our zone 1 really does encompass around our house and a little bit beyond that, but it's a small percentage of the whole. And whereas an urban lot, I shouldn't call it that, an urban homestead, zone 1 may be 50% of the property. It could be less than that. So depending on your project site will depend on how much your zone 1 is going to take up. And if you are on, this is the one thing I've noticed with a few students that are on larger properties, so say, 2 or 3 or 5 acres and up, is sometimes their zone 1 becomes quite large. And that can be really challenging for that person if they were to implement their design and just trying to cover that space, because zone 1 is a really high traffic area, and it's basically where you're putting the highest level of maintenance into your property. So just keep that in the back of your mind. Let us take a look at some of the things that are being asked for. And Marian, we're going to get to your question. Thank you for putting it in the document there. Good to see you today. So the first thing we want to do is take your base map, and you want to highlight where the zone 1 is on your base map. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. And I have a couple of examples we can show you. So with that, you want to figure out your patterns, design patterns that you're going to have within that. You're going to look at the water management. So this is a really important piece, regardless of the size of your property or your project site, is the water end. And it's becoming more and more of a priority, I would say, with time. We are, humans in general are using more and more water, whether that's at home or agriculturally or in an industry. So we need to really build in some strong pieces that look at how we manage our water. And that could be whether that's water coming off your roof, out of a well, out of a creek. It really is dependent on your site. But what I'm hoping to see with the zone 1 water management is some interconnectiveness with your water system. So that, let's say you have an urban setting and you're putting in a rain garden, which is a really good strategy for urban settings. What we would like to see is how that connects with the rest of your water system. Perhaps, just an example, perhaps you're collecting rainwater off the roof into a cistern, and the overflow, because eventually your cistern is going to be filled, perhaps the overflow goes to a rain garden. And then with your rain garden, you're going to also want to factor in an overflow for that. So no matter what kind of a rainwater structure you're looking at, even cisterns or rain barrels, we really want to think about what's going to happen when those are full, or when you have one of those 24-hour rain events, the record rain events that you had indicated in your climate section early on in the course. There's lots of information about rain gardens for those who want to place those into your designs. We have, like I said, we're on 5 acres, and I think we're going to be building in a rain garden ourselves onto our property. So it's really it's not specific to urban, but it is really specific to the site. If you had a lot of clay in your soils, you're really, that's maybe not a good idea, because you won't have enough infiltration. You might end up really with a pond. So if a pond is what you're after, that's great. But a rain garden is something that will be draining or infiltrating over a period of 24 to 48 hours, right? So it shouldn't be holding water beyond that. So yeah, the water management is huge. And probably the next Q&A we have, I will go through a little bit more about the process that our company goes through with our designs, because if we look at the template file that you're going to be left with at the end of the program, I mean, it's just massive. And if you were going to now look at designing for others, you know, you use that template, you know, you would be working quite a bit for your clients. So give you a little bit of a heads up with that on the next Q&A meeting. And let's see here. So if we go to the next section, the next bullet here, we want that proposed plan. So what's proposed in zone 1, and that could be earthworks or vegetation. Perhaps it's a structure, could be patios, you know, could be all sorts of things depending on your project site and where your zone 1 is located. So I think that is covering a pretty good. Of course, there's an intro video here that Andrew's put together, and there's also some assignment resources, although it doesn't look like we have much in that. Looks like it's just this introduction. So this again is an important document, and I love giving feedback on the zone 1, and I typically spend a lot more time with the zone 1 and final designs, just reviewing them and providing the feedback. But is there any questions at all other than Marion? I know we're going to take a look at your question here right after. Is there any questions anybody has regarding the zone 1 assignment that they're maybe unsure of? And you can put that in the chat, or you can just unmute yourself, whatever works. Okay. We will go on. Actually, what we'll do, Marion, just before we get to your question, is we'll look at a couple of examples here. So here's the first example, and I'm not even going to bother with the building survey. It's, you know, it's extremely straightforward, and it's a pretty light assignment for most people to go through. It is very interesting. There's no doubt of that. But the zone 1, again, that zone 1 assignment is really what we're after here. So this student here, who happens to live in Canada, they put together their existing conditions here. So this is an important part. It's good to know what we are looking at before any design work has been done. We're showing water flow, and there's a little bit of this is nice to see, where we have the base plan, and then there is a polygon here indicating what portion of the landscape is going to be within the zone 1 design. And then here's an extension of that existing conditions. So this is nice to include, so we know sort of where you're starting from, and the goals and the patterns and some of the strategies here. And then here is the proposed water management strategy. So this person is going to do micro irrigation, which is a great idea. You could call that drip as well. Those are sort of somewhat synonymous. They're going to bring in shade trees, they're going to put a swale in, and they're going to look at gray water. So from a water standpoint, there's a lot of different approaches here, and I haven't really dove into how these all interconnect, but we do want to have sort of a broad range of strategies. A silver bullet is not something you want to look at, and that's often what we find when people are inquiring with us regarding rainwater harvesting. is they see a cistern or a tank on their property as a silver bullet. That's going to solve their water challenges. And there's no doubt it is very, very helpful, but it is not, it's not the silver bullet. So we want to have more resilience. And so this sort of approach is, it's just much safer. And here's the proposed plan. I'm not going to get into the plan and, good or bad or otherwise. I don't, there's no judgment here at all. It's just really how it's being described. So I like the idea of, there's been some images. The labeling is very clear. There's a scale, there's a north arrow, their name, all the things we expect to see on that design sheet. And then here is some images, some inspirational images. Wood chip filled swale. These are lovely. Done a few of those myself and very, very effective. But again, even if you were to design something like this into your property, what happens when it becomes overwhelmed with water, right? So you want to think about where all these overflows are going to head to. And then the SWOT analysis, which we don't need to get into, but that's a pretty good example of zone 1. And that's really the core of the landscape. Let me see, I think we have another example we can take a look at, and then we'll get to questions. And again, the building survey is pretty straightforward. So here in this person's, I'm not sure exactly where they are located, but we will find out. Here is some of their existing conditions. So it looks like they're on an agricultural setting. And here is one of their drawings. Now, excuse me, you can see if we just compare the last one where we have these existing conditions we're asking for, and the one I just showed you doesn't have that. This is basically their zone 1 design rather than describing or depicting what is going on existing. So this is the way you want to lean towards. You want to show what's there and then what you're going to do with that. Okay. But again, this is clearly labeled and it gives us a good idea with this. There's some things that are missing here, but it does give us a fairly clear idea of where their zone 1 is. They have some water included, but if this was my student, I would be asking a little bit more about the water end and how that's all going to tie in. That's probably, one area they could perhaps improve upon, especially when we're looking at zone 1 and we have typically all these roof surfaces that are just, there as a resource. So we really want to try and optimize those as best we can. Okay, so Marion, you have an excellent question here. Let's take a look at that. So your question, you want to know the difference between strategies, patterns, and design elements. So I had to think about that one. And that's a really good question. So thank you for that. So strategies, Marion, I think strategies come out of challenges that you will see on a site. As an example, where I live, our home is near the top of the property in terms of elevation. We're on almost the highest point. So naturally, our landscape is driest around our zone 1 and our home. So part of our strategy with dealing with this sort of drier what was once depleted landscape is to integrate stormwater management and rainwater management into that space to try and slow down the water that's coming off of roofs, off of our driveway. We have a ditch on our property we can access. So that's really a strategy. Okay. Now the pattern is much more of an ambiguous term, but the pattern would be, there are so many examples of this. A pattern in a landscape might be the contour lines. It may be the way a riparian area winds through a landscape. It could be the pattern. It could be in some ways the pattern of your access roads. I'm working on a 70-acre farm design right now, and one of the patterns that jump out is there's a rail line going through the property, right? So I know, Marion, you have a road that cuts part of your property off, but this client of ours has a road, and plus they have a railroad that goes through it, and then a huge change in grade. So all of these patterns get established in terms of the visual patterns. So they are very visual. And I won't show it to you today, but those patterns are being picked up in what we call our Keyline cultivation pattern, patterns that we are going to use when we go and plant significant trees in the landscape, when we do agroforestry, or we're basically on this project going to have lines of trees, nut and fruit trees, and alleyways in between them. So the alleyways in between are going to be used for either livestock. They could be used for annual production. They could just be used for pasture, for hay. So that is my interpretation of pattern. And your design elements are specific elements within your landscape, and they could come under many things. They could be a rainwater harvesting system is an element. You might have an outdoor kitchen, outdoor patio, in your zone 1. That's what we're trying to create this year where we are, is we have a really heavy duty element of edible landscape, but we want to integrate an off-grid outdoor kitchen. So if we have no power and it's inclement weather, we have a covered, safe place to cook our food that just requires wood. Those I see as elements. And Marion, does that help you out? Does that make a little more sense?
It does. I'm just in the assignment, they're asking to state our strategies and patterns. And in the examples, it wasn't quite what you just explained, what people did. So it's like almost, it's very similar. I mean, I feel like those three are really similar anyways.
Yeah, I wouldn't lose sleep over it.
Right.
Okay, because the main it's that graphical component of your drawing is what I'm gonna really be dialing into. You may on your property have a strategy of improving your soil quality in any pasture area. right? That's a very broad strategy, but that also ties into rainwater management as well, where if you have 1% increase in organic matter in your pasture, you're going to be holding 20,000 extra gallons of water per acre. So those are strategies. The patterning, like I say, that is a little bit ambiguous. It's a tricky word. There's some things I don't really even think about. I just sort of do, but I see the patterns myself as more visual. So when you're going to describe these things, I would really be, your strategies are very important, and the patterns, if something comes up for you, then that's great. And if it doesn't, well, not to worry. Okay. Yeah. It's just do your best and what you feel. You have a pretty broad landscape, and I imagine there's a lot of visual patterns there that you could see replicating. Right. And again, sometimes that could be a keyline pattern. And I know we don't really go into that in this course. And that's something you might want to look at for your property is keyline design. That is a creation of pattern, and that's based on the contours of a land, and those aren't representative of exactly of the contours. It's really distributing water through the landscape. So it's taking water from valleys where water tends to collect, and it's sending it out to ridges, which are traditionally drier. So but that is a pattern. And Mark has left something in the chat here. I'll just take a look at. So Mark said, the past week, I read of thinking of elements and strategies, still struggling with this. What this means for patterns. Yeah, well, let me just see. That's an example.
Hey, Jamie.
Yeah.
So I read of relating like elements to strategies in a noun to verb kind of sense, which made a lot of sense all of a sudden to me. It hit me like a load of bricks. But then the way, like in the assignment, patterns and strategies are talked about in the assignment, it is kind of confusing still.
Yeah, well,
and so I don't know if pattern in this sense, without overthinking it, is just kind of how those noun and verbs go together in the context of our site.
I think that's a really good point, Mark. And I think what's just dawned on me as well is if you've identified a strategy in your landscape, often the pattern that develops from that's where the patterning could come in. So if it's let me just share some images here. If we can get one there's a nice one. So there's a keyline pattern. So the strategy on this site, and we'll just make some presumptions. We'll presume that they wanted to equally distribute water through their site the best they could. And to do so, they used a keyline design, which in turn creates patterns within their landscape. So this patterning is actually a result of the strategy that they want to employ. And this is a really fascinating, here's Ridgedale Permaculture. They've done some amazing work. And, you can see these patterns that are developed. And this is done using topographic mapping. and identify, you know, I won't go in that too deeply today, but it's, if you look at permaculture design, I've heard this before, permaculture design is, say, the entry or elementary school of regenerative design. When we get to, you know, farm design and keyline design, that's more, you know, say post-secondary, we'll say that. As in other words, as you dive deeper and deeper into land design, you will undoubtedly have this pop up on your radar, especially if you start to get into larger land designs, because running a swale on a 100-acre property just isn't going to be cost effective, right? And what happens if that swale doesn't collect any water? You have this enormous element within the landscape that's not functioning, and you know, the cost to do it would just be extraordinary. Whereas the Keyline, and I'm not trying to push Keyline, although it's certainly amazing. The Keyline, whoops. Wow, having troubles typing today. Keyline is established with a plow that looks like this. This is what's pulled behind the tractor. And it could be all kinds of versions, but this is what it does. And it may only have two. Yeah, the way these look can be entirely different. They might have 2 tines. This one's got, I think, 6 or 5. And the more you have, you know, the bigger the tractor needs to be. But the reality is, with this device, you can better manage your water without creating disruptions on the surface. You know, this is a very small disturbance. And then they have variations of this where they have a roller. So they'll, the roller is right on the end, and it's rolling and pushing that cut down so that it meets up again. And they do this often if they want to put livestock on the land quite soon after they've done their keyline plowing. There's another good example. Now we've used this. Here's one just with 2. Excuse me a minute. Oh. We've used this on job sites just to decompact a large area. And it's an amazing tool because it will, if you look at the shape of this, it's an ingenious plow. It has sort of a safety mechanism. It has a shear pin up here. So if you're plowing and you hit a rock, the pin will break at a certain threshold instead of the plow itself breaking. So when these are going through the subsurface of the ground, they are breaking up and decompacting the ground below it without creating disturbance on the top. So that's one way of using it, is just to decompact a surface. And that's where the patterning is less of an issue. If you're trying to distribute water, and here's a classic, you know, this is P.A. Yeoman's property in Australia. He's the one who designed the Keyline system. And it takes a fair, you know, it would take a fair bit of explanation, but basically on this property, they're holding water in ponds and they're distributing water via irrigation channels. So they're flood irrigating. So Janine would like that. This is just on a much bigger scale. And you can see the effect. And these are still, still operational, low tech. There's no pumping. It's all gravity fed. But, you know, it's quite specific to this landscape because a lot of Australian landscapes have been deforested. So you have these kind of idyllic rolling hilled older landscapes. And there's some other examples. Now the key, no pun intended, the key here is you have even spacing between the rows so that this is a completely usable space for your agricultural application, regardless of what that is. If you have animals out here, which you'd have to fence for, right? You'd have to put temporary fencing up. You might run some annual crops in here. There's a multitude of applications, and this is a pretty good image showing those. So it's even spaced, but it is based on what's called the key point in the landscape. And the key point is where that slope changes from convex to concave, right? And I'm not going to go into this for any deeper, other than it's absolutely fascinating. And for those on larger acreages that have identified compaction as a challenge, the plow can be a savior. And in some cases, you might have to do it multiple times over multiple years, but often one application will do it. There's a good illustration. One of the best sites, believe it or not, is a colleague down in Victoria. He got a grant to purchase the plow. So we have one on Vancouver Island at crkeyline.ca. So if you want some more information about that, you can go on that site, and it explains all about the history. And he's a student, one of Darren Doherty's students, the Agrarian. Darren Doherty did the Agrarian Platform. He developed that. I'm sort of an ongoing student of that as well. But this is a great website. It has a lot of very, very interesting information in it. So I would encourage you to take a look at that if you are indeed interested in that. So, okay. Now, does that help anybody a little bit with patterns and strategies and design elements? So I guess with what we were just looking at, we could say our strategy is going to improve water distribution, and we're going to be using a Keyline plow to do that. And the patterns are basically developed from that process, and the design element could end up being you know, the sort of agroforestry or mixed tree perennial cropping system, right? So these are really innovative approaches to agriculture, and in my opinion, which is completely biased, this is the direction that we should be heading in order to maintain some level of ecology within our ecology within our agricultural systems that tend to be just large monocropped operations. But this requires a lot more skill in terms of designing, and productivity would change a little bit, right? So here's another good illustration of how water will accumulate into these valleys. And if your contour map is such, there may be an opportunity to run a key line, or we'll even, it could be a swale from this wet spot to a dry spot, but still have some fall to it, so that that water travels. Yeah, anyways, there's no end of rabbit holes to go down. And I think that was the only question that was on for lesson number 9. So I guess I'll leave that to everybody here. Do you have any more questions that you want to talk about, or do you want to talk about your project at all, or anything about your zone 1 that you might want to share, or just unsure about? I'm totally open to anything you want to talk about. We've got almost 20 minutes left today, so totally up to you, all of you, what you'd like to do with it.
I have a question. My zone 1 is primarily annual crops intermixed with some perennials. So on the side of just building out these, now it's taking a minute to pull, the zone 1 design plan that has all of the different common and Latin names and, you know, the different plant callouts that work together. I don't really have any guilds in my zone 1. It's more of just the cut and herb garden and annuals. So should I expand that a little bit, or should I do my zone 2, which includes more of my guilds and perennials, shrubs?
No, I would stick with your zone 1, Amy. And if that has, you know, less, like if I looked at my zone 1, it's primarily going to be annual crops, places for us to sit, access to the building. And there's, you know, we're sort of fringed, you know, or surrounded by more of the permanent plantings. So yeah, I would not be at all concerned with just labeling it. You know, what I might suggest, if we looked at this example, and these are all primarily perennial, perennial and native plants. You know, you could designate an area as an annual vegetable garden and maybe just list some of the plants that you're thinking about putting in there. You know, not exactly where they're going, but just as a general. So this, you know, say it's a 8x10 area, and these are the plants that you're hoping to grow over the course of the year. That would be just great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Has anybody else got anything they'd like to share, or questions about this, or even the next week? Or not, sorry, not next week. Next lesson, which would be the final design. That's the bigger picture, which of course will be a lot easier because you've already chunked off zone 1 when we get to that one. But yeah, I would say, just as a kind of overview, again, I'm repeating myself somewhat, but really do dial into your water resources and try and utilize what's coming off of your rooftops and even your patios and walkways or driveways. You know, those are all resources, really. So it's best to try and utilize them the best possible way, because there's no doubt placing water within your soils is it's the low-hanging fruit in terms of water storage. It's the lowest cost approach. You can't necessarily pump that water later in the year like you can in a cistern, but it is, you know, cisterns are really expensive. We design and install rainwater systems, and availability and cost of cisterns has just gone through the roof this year. It's gotten really bad because now people are wanting to, really jump on board. Where I live, the government, our provincial government, has just circulated some information a couple of years ago. It was a bit of a free-for-all with agricultural properties, that if you had a pond or well or some water rights, not so much the water rights, but groundwater extraction, you could basically take as much as you want. There was no limitations, very little. So they've kind of brought the hammer down on that over the last few years, and they're restricting. You have to get licensed to extract from groundwater if you're an agricultural producer. And now they're bringing that to the next stage, which is applying that to all property owners that pull water from the ground out, that's utilizing water outside of their household. So you're allowed to irrigate, I think it's up to 1,000 square meters of space, which, that's quite a bit. That's about, over 4,000 square feet of area. And if you go beyond that, you have to apply for a license. And even if you are below that, I can see when we get into, say, a dry summer, like our typical summers now, and we have pretty heavy duty water restrictions. They never used to apply to well owners. Well, they're going to be doing that now. And so I see the rainwater harvesting end of things just exploding in British Columbia as soon as people realize this. And there's just not enough suppliers, let alone cisterns. So long story short, trying to diversify your water management is a great idea. And the more variation you have within your design, the better. So if you have cisterns and you have some, say you have keyline patterns and you have an irrigation pond, and the list goes on, that's really building a resilient landscape. Because for us, we are going to be looking at putting in an irrigation pond. We have a pond already, but it's not really for extracting water out of it. It's not quite large enough for that, but we're going to redo it. And we want to be able to hold probably 50,000 gallons in a pond that we can draw from on top of our rainwater collection in our cisterns. So all this water is going to get pulled off of our rooftop and sent, somewhere. And that's the way it is right now. It's going into the landscape, but it's just going to get diverted into an irrigation pond. And that way we have some water sovereignty. And I don't like the government telling me basically to do anything, let alone, what I'm supposed to do on my property, and limit my ability to grow food. Although I do appreciate the conservation part of that message, but we're already doing that. So, as much as possible. So we don't want to use our well at all for any irrigation use, period. And we tend to have to do that towards the end of the season because our rainwater gets depleted. But hopefully with our new strategy that we'll employ, we'll not have to worry about that. So that was just a little quick aside, maybe not quick, but an aside on the whole water scheme. And I do think, especially with the work we do, the design work we do, that is the first layer that we look at when we are looking at an urban or a small acreage, is that water layer. That's the first thing, and everything gets built around it. And when we're looking at farm design, it's not the first thing, because the layered design system is a little different. There's 10 different layers, but it's number 3. And that trumps, sorry if I'm using a word that triggers people, that trumps the access layer, building layer. So most people will put a house or a barn where they think, it's perfect, go right here. No. You have to go through a few layers before you even realize where a barn, for instance, is going to make the most sense. Your water needs to be established, your access, where your roads are. And then obviously you're going to put a barn near your access. You're not going to have it in a position where, you're going to have to put in some costly roadworks. So I better stop talking about farm design. You can tell what I'll be doing tomorrow. Is there anything? Oh, I think Mark has a message here. Soil fertility map for lesson 10. Okay, let's take a look at that.
I was looking at that same example project, and the slide is missing his soil fertility map.
Well, I think what's happened is that some of the examples, like the course has been changing quite radically over the past, as you know, Mark, because this is your second rendition here. The first one was a 10-week, and that's, I believe, one of the first of the courses that we introduced the new template file. Now, what was I looking at here? Sorry. We're going to go look at that week, that final design. Soil fertility map. Okay, so if we look at the template itself, and we'll have to go to the very end. Let's see what graphics they have. So there's your existing plan and your concept. And that's a good thing to keep in mind too, right? This is a concept. So we're not looking at, a huge amount of detail. You can put as much detail in as you wish. Water management, soil fertility. Yeah, well, I think that's pretty straightforward. So with that fertility plan on this slide, they're really just asking for the overall strategy. And everybody's is going to be, I don't know anyone ever who has said my soil's perfect. I don't have to do anything forever to improve it. So you need to have a strategy of constantly managing it. Well, here's an example. We grow 95% of our own veggies, and we have a lot of perennial edibles as well. But with our annual beds, we're in a no-till system. So our specific soil management strategy is each year, actually right now, we are sowing a whole bunch of winter field peas. Sometimes they're called cow peas. And that's a cover crop. So we're just applying that to the top of the bed, and then we're adding an inch of compost. And what we do, that's a soil management strategy. That's a nitrogen fixing plant. When it, normally we would have done this in the fall, but we had crops there that we were still harvesting. So we're doing it now as the weather permits. It's been beautiful weather here the last few days. It's warming up. So we apply the seed, apply the compost. So the compost hides the seed and the birds don't take it all, because at this time of year, cover crop seeding is challenging because the birds are hungry. They want what they can get. Amongst other things, rodents love peas. And then as these peas come on, we will, let's say we were growing cabbage to place in a bed, and we'll grow those in flats in our greenhouse. And then when we're ready to plant them out, say in that bed, we'll go along and we'll cut down the peas. So that's all you have to do. And then the peas are dead. So this cover crop pea will cut to the ground. We'll plant our cabbage probably at 18-inch spacings. We have 30-inch wide beds, so we'll probably get 3 rows in there. And then we'll take the pea, all the tops that we've cut, and we'll place it back on the bed as a mulch in between the plants. And that's really our soil strategy, for a typical strategy for the annual beds that we've got. We avoid at all costs going in and digging and turning the soil, and all of these things that you may have to do to begin with. You may feel you need to jumpstart an area and disturb it, and which you do. For annuals to grow, you have to disturb the soil, but it's the manner in which you go about it. I've spent a fair bit of time studying soil and the soil food web, soil organisms. And the more you learn about these things, the more you realize some of our practices really go against their best interests. So if you rototill an area, if you see in an agricultural setting, them plowing or tilling, they're completely destroying the top surface of soil. And it's not a good long-term approach. We try and utilize all organics. So say we were creating a new garden, and I think I touched on this with Amy, with the front of her property. If you have turf, a lawn that you don't want, well, that turf has a lot of value in that it's a living, you have a band of soil below that turf that's full of life. So when you're stripping that out, or however you're getting rid of it, you want to think about how you can retain it. How can you retain that product so that it's helping you build soil? And there's all kinds of ways you can do that. And I guess in some ways, sheep mulching is a good example. So you're killing the turf without removing it. So light suppression. I don't really like sheep mulching, and that's just a personal thing. And mainly because if you put cardboard on your soil surface, you've just basically trapped all your organisms below ground. Anything that has to come up is not going to be able to. So I don't like that idea. So what we will do, and we're doing this week, is we have an area where we have some perennial weed issues and we want to grow potatoes. So it could be turf. It's not, but let's say it was. We're just going to put down some silage tarps, and those are fantastic. So we buy silage tarps. We have these special bags you put aggregate in, and we place the bags on the tarp to hold them down. And we're going to leave that silage tarp there for, well, if we get it down this week, we'll leave it there maybe till May, and then peel it back and see what we have. And it will certainly destroy all of the annual weeds, because the silage tarp has two color. We usually have the black side facing up, so it heats the soil, it encourages germination, and then there's no light, so you get a collapse, right? Any perennials coming up are going to hit the tarp and just not, I've gotten rid of morning glory doing that. We actually put morning glory in our compost piles, which is completely opposite to what people will tell you, right? They'll say, never put that in your compost. Well, you can if you do one of two things. You either heat it to 160 degrees, so you have a thermophilic compost with lots of heat, which takes a lot of management. It takes a while to be able to do that properly. Or we just run landscape fabric. We do windrows of compost and run fabric over the top of it and pin it down, and it suppresses all the light, so everything dies. There's no, plus it allows water through, and that's the critical part. We get air and water going in there, but we don't have light. There's not enough light to support any of those unwanted weeds. So let's see here. Aha, Amy, mine is down. That's great. Okay. Well, we're getting near the end of our hour here. I've managed to talk about a lot of things that aren't really related. Mark, is that clear with the soil fertility? Yeah. Okay, that's great. Again, it's just a strategy, and your strategy may change every year. And we have different strategies for different parts of our garden too. So that, that may also be something that you find develops.
Hey, Jamie, if you have, say, 5 microclimates on a given property, would you expect at a minimum to have maybe 5 different soil strategies for each of those, one per microclimate? Or does that not relate?
That may be the case, but I wouldn't expect it to be. I would say with our situation, with our annual vegetable production, they're in distinct, there's 2 main areas, which drives me a little bit crazy, but this is the way our property is. So we have 2 different areas where we're doing that kind of work, and they're completely different microclimates. One's cooler, windy, the other's way more protected and, heat loving, and the strategies are completely the same. We may not, when I said, oh, we put down cowpea right now, we may not do that next year in the same area, mixing up the cover crop. Like, we like to use cover crop and a nitrogen fixing cover crop when possible. But I'm sure what you'll find is this will spark that interest within you that gets you thinking about it, because the soil really is everything if you want to produce food. You don't cultivate plants, you cultivate soil. And I don't mean that by disturbing soil. I mean, give your soil love, and the plants are going to respond, providing you're putting the appropriate plant in the right spot. But it is all about the soil. So the more focus that gets, the better your results are going to be. And that falls into compaction and, all sorts of other things. So again, it's a very deep subject, and we're just skimming the surface of it. We're just touching on it. But we're, at the end of the course, you're all going to have a lot of tools, and you're going to have access to all of the information on the platform here for as long as the servers are running. So you can come back and reference all this stuff. I don't think you're going to be able to comment or ask questions, because nobody's going to, no instructor goes and visits a previous class, but you know, it's just a great resource, and consider this really the beginning of your journey, and it's a new way to look at land and managing it. And then the more you learn about it, the more horrifying it becomes when you see what your neighbors are doing, right? Because you know that we have a bunch of horticulture practices in place that are really not that sound, but we're used to them, so they get perpetuated. But things are changing, and you know, you can certainly be a big part of that, shifting what you do on your property and influencing others in a positive way. Okay. So is there anything else anybody would like to ask before we wrap up today? No? Okay. Well, I'm glad that we had some really good questions today, and I hope that was helpful. Best of luck with your Zone 1 work, and I'm sure it'll be epic. I'm really looking forward to looking at your assignments next Monday, and then we're on to the finale. Let's see where that goes. But anyways, thank you very much for taking an hour out of your day, everybody, and best of luck this week, and we'll look forward to connecting next week sometime. See you later.